We're returning to cases to review the SilverStone Redline 06, which gets the first taste of some updated testing methods in our suite, though they're not done yet. SilverStone's RL06 case is poised to be the best thermal performer on our bench in some time, using its mesh front to help in a world overrun with glass. The SilverStone RL06 comes in white with silver trim, black with red trim, and white with different fans implemented. The RL06 Pro is what we're reviewing today, and that one's priced at $75 MSRP. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and their 1080 Ti SC2, which we've recommended fairly highly for its build quality and the ICX sensors, which are kind of fun to play with. You can check our full SC2 review for the 1080 Ti if you're curious to learn more, or you can click the link in the description below to find the product page for the 1080 Ti SC2. For basics, the SilverStone RL06 sizes up at 200 by 477 by 455 millimeters with height depth and weighs 6.3 kilograms. The enclosure we're reviewing includes 3 fans for front intake, 1 rear fan, and options for top fans. All the included fans are 120 millimeters with RPM up to around 1400 plus or minus the usual range. CPU tower cooler clearance is 158 millimeters, meaning it fits most appropriate coolers on the market for the price. And this case is priced similarly to a couple others we've reviewed recently, including the Corsair 270R, the kind of old but still relevant NZXT S340, and the Fractal Define C. After that, we start getting into $100 territory where you've got things like the 400C and stuff like that, S340 Elite. But for direct competition, it's looking like 270R and Fractal Define C on our bench, along with some other items we'll have on there. But this one is quite a bit different from some of the other $70-ish, $80-ish cases that we've reviewed in the past year. And that's because this has a return to mesh front intake. So it should be a much better thermal performer, as we'll see soon. It's got a mesh top, a mesh front, no tempered glass, and is fairly standard in construction overall, but just comes down to do you want noise performance or thermal performance? This one targets thermals, which is not something we've seen a whole lot in the last year, so that'll be interesting to test. Starting off first with ease of installation features prior to getting to the thermals and noise testing, the SilverStone RL06 proved a little more difficult to work with than seemed necessary. The RL06 has some space constraints, lacking some of the cable management features of the Fractal Define C, like its depth in the rear side panel, or cable management features in cases like the S340 and Elite, where it's got a cable bar. The RL06 does no work for you in this department. You'll be left to your own devices to manage the cables. There is an acceptable number of cable tie points on the rear side, but they're placed around cutouts in such a way that cables tied to them will be clearly visible from outside the case. Vertical space is limited. There's a chunky shroud in the bottom, which is a bit of a trend, but that does mean you've got more limited vertical space, and it may be difficult to fit some plugs through the uppermost cutouts. The shroud size does mean that there's plenty of breathing room for the PSU, however, which makes routing cables under the motherboard and over the top of the PSU easier than other cases of this type. This also means that it captures nearly all the airflow from the bottom 120mm fan and doesn't smother the hot hard drives that will be in the same shroud area. The power supply has to be slid in sideways through the shroud. You can't install through the back, and that's, again, a bit different, but speaks to the price focus of the case. And there's plenty of room to get it in through the side, just don't use an oversized PSU. The RL06 is undeniably a budget case. At first glance, there are no glaring flaws, but there are small details everywhere that indicate the cost savings to the user. For example, silver rivets on the back of the case mean that this job is done after painting, assembly, and it normally is assembled after painting, but they're not using the painted rivets, so very small thing there. There are no rubber grommets anywhere. That is actually a somewhat important cost savings for these cases, and there are no thumb screws for the expansion slots. There's also no removable frame for the power supply like you get with the S340 type cases or Corsair 600C case. The side panels are held on with standard metal tabs, none of the fancy sliding or folding out functionality. None of these affect the functionality of the case overall, but it is a point that you should take note of if you're trying to keep an eye out for those finer details. It does, however, help reduce cost for the user. As always, appearance is subjective, but it's refreshing to see a case offered in a color other than plain black. The white LEDs in the front of the case are bright true white rather than a bluish tint that RGB LEDs produce, and the mesh front showcases them without allowing too much light through. The front panel is slick, fingerprint-prone plastic, which isn't a problem with the white case, but could be a much worse problem with the black version, though after you build it once, you should probably stop touching it anyway. It's also unfortunately molded in such a way that the parts don't quite fit flush with the side panel, but not a huge deal here. The 3 LED fans are high quality. Comparable SilverStone fans cost about $12 to $15 on Newegg, making the fans easily half the total value of the case if you're just looking at hard MSRPs to the user. Many cases, like the BitPhoenix Shogun, include only a few of the cheapest fans possible to bring down the retail price. SilverStone's added value by including a sufficient number of fans of a sufficient quality so you don't have to swap them out and waste money on bad fans with a new case. There's an integrated fan hub on the backside of the motherboard to further improve value in the cooling department, and SilverStone's really not messing around with the subtle side intakes or anything like that. Air goes in the front and comes out the back, plain and simple. Nothing with glass panels or side front intake amalgams that we've seen in many other cases lately. Getting to the thermals and noise, as always, the testing methodology is linked in the description below for the article. We have a few new tests here that don't have any comparative data for other cases yet. We've got a main chart, of course, with all the other cases on it, but the new tests are something we're still playing around with. The Thermaltake P3 that we're reviewing next should have more of that, but it is debuting here with this, and we're using Blender. We'll soon be using 3D Mark for some mixed workload tests in addition to the normal torture workload. SilverStone's RL06 is the coolest case on our bench for CPU thermals, entirely thanks to its mesh front. This seems to be a fading trend in modern case design, but still provides the best intake cooling possible, no matter how big a gap is used for the front-side intake options when you have a glass front. With the case fans configured to their maximum RPM of 1400, the SilverStone RL06 enables our tower cooler to keep the CPU at 47.8 Celsius delta T over ambient when under 100% load. Idle temperatures are around 2C delta T over ambient, and because performance was so strong with this case, we lowered RPM to 1000 and ran the test again. Even with this slower speed, the CPU maintains a delta T value of under 50C. In fact, it's cooler than the 570X, which was previously our performance leader, and this difference emerges because the 570X uses a giant glass panel in front of its intake fans, though compensates in ways with large gaps on either side of that front panel. And it does have higher RPM fans and 3 fans in the front to help out some more. The next case behind these is the 270R, another Corsair design, with the fractal Define C serving as the coolest of the quiet cases. SilverStone is a clear performance leader in the CPU thermals of the cases we've tested thus far, but let's look at GPU thermals. GPU performance testing on our dual axial Gaming X at 55% fan speeds also found the RL06 in the lead. The 1400 RPM configuration places us at 47.1 Celsius delta T over ambient, followed closely by the Cullinan's 1100 RPM configuration. The Cullinan positions its front fans in a way that more directly point at the GPU, helping it take the second place spot. And the 1000 RPM RL06 follows the Cullinan, reducing noise levels while maintaining 51 Celsius delta T over ambient. We're going to show a preview of some of our new tests here. There's still a lot to be done on this front since we don't have comparative data yet, but this is the light introduction. We're starting to use Blender and 3D Mark mixed workloads for case thermal benchmarking in addition to thermal testing, just to give some perspective on user workloads. The Thermaltake P3 again will feature all of that. First off, we're measuring CPU and GPU temperatures during these tests to help understand how well the case exhaust heat buildup during load on one component and not both. Rendering on the GPU, we see a temperature of 24.7 C delta T over ambient GPU temperature. We've got the CPU temperature alongside it as well during that test. CPU delta T reached 34.4 Celsius rendering on the CPU. It may be hard to interpret these numbers without comparative data, but ambient temperature was around 22.5 during the tests, and we'll soon have comparative data with the Thermaltake P3. Anyway, these tests, by the way, were done at 1000 RPM, so you'd be a bit cooler once at 1400. Let's go to noise levels. Here's where we find out what the trade-off is for that chart-topping thermal performance. As you'd expect, a mesh front doesn't do us favors in noise despite lowered temperatures. Neither choice is inherently wrong, just depends on your build goals. At 1400 RPM, the SilverStone RL06 is the loudest system build we've tested on this chart, operating at 43 dBA. More noise escapes this enclosure given the mesh front, and that's of course in exchange for more air entering it. This makes the system about as loud as the Corsair 570X when its fans were operating at full speed. Looking at 1000 RPM as the variant, we're now down to 37 dBA on the RL06 SilverStone case, putting it between the 270R 1300 RPM and S340 1300 RPM enclosures. Given that SilverStone still holds a lead in thermals with 1000 RPM speeds, We think the case makes its best noise and temperature compromise at this 1000 RPM mark. Sure, it's not as quiet as the Be Quiet Pure Bass 600, but it's also significantly cooler and doesn't contain the word quiet in its brand name. So that's the RL06. The case at $75 is priced about where it should be. A lot of the Shroud mid-tower cases are in the $70 to $80 price point. You start getting fancier as you trend towards $100, which is kind of the top end hard line of this type of case. You get stuff like the 400C at that point. But if you're trying to spend less, this case is one that we have liked for its airflow. That's a bit different from what we've seen lately. The trend has been towards noise rather than airflow. There's really no better between noise and airflow. It depends on what you want. So if you're focused on noise really firmly, and that's extremely important to you, the most important part of a case, then don't buy this. But if you really care about airflow and noise, as long as it's 37-ish dBA, at least with our bench, obviously you have to factor in the fact that the parts inside also make noise. 37 dBA in our bench, which is a fairly standard build, is fine to you, then this is a good case. The cooling is fantastic. It's a small box. It's fairly portable if you needed to move it. The airflow is very directed, so we've got the top two fans pointed straight at the CPU cooler, if you've got a tower cooler, and straight at the GPU cooler. And then the bottom fan does help stave away any concerns of heating up on the drive components, which are inside the power supply shroud if you're running 3.5-inch hard drives. So that's the case. Good overall. It's got a couple of small flaws, but you do trade off for those. You've got lower cost as a result of some of them, like the side panels, they're not exciting the way they mount and dismount. But for $25 cheaper than something that is more exciting, like the 400C, it's not a bad trade. As always, you can find the full article linked in the description below, which was written by Patrick for the site. And also subscribe for more so you don't miss the Thermaltake P3 review with our new testing methodology that is more implemented there. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or store.gamersnexus.net to buy one of our shirts. We've got tri-blends now. They're very comfortable. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time. We're returning to cases to review the SilverStone RL06 today, which gets the first taste of our